Hi everyone, welcome to the Play Creators Conference 21. I think I've got the year right. And today we've got a great panel. We're going to be talking about licensed games. So I think, as always with these things, rather than me doing the introductions, it'd be nicely if you just give a little quick introduction about yourself, and then we'll get on to our first question. Who should we start with? Let's start with left to right. Let's start with Erica.
All right. So my name is Erica Bliers. I am a staff designer at Spin Master, and prior to that, I was a freelance game designer. Do you want more, or is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay.
Omari?
Yeah, sure. I'm Omari Akil. So I'm actually the co-founder and CEO of Colorway Game Labs. And I also dabble in some freelance design as well.
Cool.
And I'm Deirdre Cross. I'm a VP over at Funko Games and also on the Prospero Hall team. And before that, spent about 12 years as independent inventors.
So I think between us, we should be able to answer most people's questions. It's kind of interesting because we've done game panel sessions before. I did one last year with you, Deirdre. But I think this year, we want to talk particularly about licensed games. And I was thinking about this actually, that for a lot of game designers, unless you work for a games company, it's probably unlikely that you will have designed a licensed game. You might have ideas for licensed games, but whether you actually get to design a licensed game, because we know that, there's a lot goes into a licensed game. So I think we're probably going to be talking, obviously people who are in the business who maybe kind of want to get designing games, but they think actually I haven't really designed any licensed games. So we're going to be talking to those people, kind of game pros. But I think we're also going to be talking to a lot of people who design games and are interested in designing games, but maybe not have ever done a licensed game before. So I think we can be quite 101 about it at points, because there is a lot of kind of differences, I think. So I think on that subject, just to kind of let's touch on the kind of the core differences from our perspectives on what it is to design a regular game to maybe design a licensed game. We can drill into some stuff later on, but kind of top level. Erica, do you want to kind of kick off and just kind of basic thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, funny enough, now is probably the best time ever if you wanted a chance to get into IPs based on what things have been before. I think licenses have never been more open than they are now. So there's definitely something we can talk to towards that. But what's kind of neat about IP games, which is kind of their, pros and cons all wrapped into one, is that it's an existing sandbox. There are already rules to this world. There's already characters to this world. Everything interacts in a very specific way, and the fans know exactly how it interacts in that very specific way. So what's really cool is that you get to jump in and say this world already exists, and I get to play in it, and I get to bring it to life. But this world already exists, so you need to know the rules of that world that you're playing in, and you can't make them up. And so that's where it's a really interesting line.
No, that's really interesting, because you're right that particularly if it's a very much a fan-driven product, and obviously licensed products vary between, obviously if there's a kid where they're still fans, but they may not give you a lot of grief on Twitter, whereas there's going to be fans who will give you a lot of grief on Twitter. So you're right. You need to get your ducks in a row. Omari, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think, my perspective, especially coming from, like the most recent IP that we used was a song. And so, taking, it feels very similar to how Erica describes, except for, using brands and identities that don't have the same kind of structure as, say like a narrative based IP. You can play around a little bit more there, but you still have to stay really true to the content in some way. And so you're really, just trying to pick out what are the things that people connect with the most about this brand or this IP, and sinking your teeth into that, and trying to make that work with the design. And I was grateful that we could bend the world that we worked with a little bit to make it work. But yeah, every license kind of gives you a different tool set to work with and kind of operate in that. And those guidelines are sometimes as helpful as they are kind of get in the way of the process.
Yeah, I think we'll probably touch on that. There's definitely there's a big difference. And they say the song is a really interesting one. I've never done that. I've thought about it a couple of times. We've never actually kind of worked on that. And I think the kind of the emotional hooks that, you know, as you said, Erica, the sandbox people bringing that together. You know, story, visuals, a film has one thing, a kind of narrative, and a song kind of has slightly different emotions, maybe.
Feeling,
that, you know,
yeah.
it's kind of personal. So it's quite interesting to kind of touch on those and make people feel that, you know, what was going on in them when they sort of listen to that music, how that kind of translates into the game. So it's kind of cool. I'd really like to play that. Deirdre, obviously you've got huge experience in a whole bunch of different IPs, but you've worked on non-licensed and licensed as well. So, you know, you're kind of excellent kind of archive of knowledge to kind of talk about that.
Yeah, there's I mean, yeah, almost no limit to what IP you could draw on to make a game out of, like Omari saying, a song, you know, a film, a franchise. You know, a few years ago, we made some games for Bob Ross. Like, this is a man standing in front of a paint. He's just painting. There is no story. There's no story, right? And that one all comes down to, how does it make you feel? How do you feel when you're watching it? What does it do for you? What's bigger than what is being shown in the IP? And that could go for Bob Ross, it could go for Pop-Tarts, it could go for a breakfast cereal, it could go for, you know, the Disney villains. It's all in there. It's all how it makes you feel. And that's, for us, that's where we start.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think, you know, obviously we talk a lot about storytelling and obviously storytelling often from the kind of brand owner's point of view, you know, the story that they want to tell, the consistent story that, you know, you're allowed to tell. But you're right, from a consumer's point of view, it is all about the feeling. And when we play something, not just a game, but I think it comes out in games. And you know, obviously there's a lot of licensed products out there, you know, from all manner. As you said, Erica, that one thing, license owners are much more open now to licensing. They see the potential, you know, of doing that. And I think kind of talking about that kind of openness and maybe kind of the opportunities. I don't know, Erica, you think kind of where else that could kind of take us, that kind of openness? Where, you know, do you sort of, I think a question for all of us really, but sort of thinking about, we've seen a big shift, I think, even in the last few years of, you know, probably like Marvel and what they've done and kind of opened the door with their brands. I'm just thinking if there's other possibilities that you could think about that we kind of
think a big translation one I've noticed where they're a little more open to, you're going to see a lot more indie publishers that kind of have access to, is, you know, it might not be the Disneys, but it's going to be like the independent comics. It's going to be some of these, like, I've even seen people, like, I mean, reaching out directly to authors who are interested in having their you know, their story translated in some way. And that's the difference now is, yes, there's going to be those big mass companies that have those relationships, those brands that are like working together, but we are so much bigger than that now. Right. So it's, you know, it's not what it used to be. Let's say, you know, like there's some reminiscence of, let's say, it would look like in the 90s, and you'd only see these mass produce, you know, IP games. Now you're seeing, you know, you can have people playing in the same sandbox, but having very different audiences, because there are the young and old audiences for a lot of these things, and they're not the same player. They're not the same consumer in any way. Right. And they don't want the same experience. So now you have even more fun where something that might have been considered kids is now considered nostalgic. And now you have something all new you can do. You have a whole new audience you can go after. And I don't think we've ever had that before. This is so much more open, I think, than it ever has been, which means really cool potentials. It's also maybe a little bit of a worry of, are there too many voices in the same space? But I guess that's going to be something we have to figure out as we keep going.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because you're right. The toy business and the games business. The games business have been doing this for years, and the toy business has been a catch on. Is that that their market historically was up to 10-year-olds, and that was it. And then
I know,
might
it's like, oh, nobody wants anything after that. You know what I mean?
Of course, there is the potential now that people have realised that we've got the right kind of games for people that can play all their lives, and suddenly your market potential there is huge. And I suppose those people never went to toy shops probably, and so they can never really see this product. But now, obviously, with online, of course, social media, which is perfect for obviously promoting games because you're promoting fun, and people like to promote fun. Let's be honest. That gives us you're right, a huge potential. So I think Omari I'm just thinking, with the song, kind of, that's just kind of put your toe in the water there of something kind of much bigger, maybe.
Yeah, that's a unique concept in itself. A song.
Yeah. I mean, we ended up kind of getting the license sort of generally. It was DJ Jazzy Jeff and Fresh Prince. And so we didn't know 100% that was the direction we were going to take it. But in so many ways, it made the most sense. You think about that brand and them as a musical entity, and there's a few standouts. And so picking one felt like the right thing to do. But it did, for us, it definitely opened our eyes to the potential. And like Erica was saying, like with IPs being, I think, a lot more open and available now, us as a small publisher, we actually see some opportunity to say, hey, we're not going to be able to get the biggest things necessarily, but we can poke at some of the smaller brands ourselves and potentially, be able to work and find deals there.
And it's exciting, I think, for the brand owners, because they're obviously, as you say, not always the Disneys of this world. That's a kind of in a way, although it's good for the big guys, not for the small guys, obviously. But there's that kind of win-win scenario where the brand owner isn't necessarily looking for hundreds of thousands of units before you reach your minimum guarantee. And for those who know, minimum guarantee is a big thing we're licensing. You can't just sort of turn around to Disney and go, we only sold 1,000. Never mind. That doesn't work. So, but I think that the idea of unlocking, all the extra potential, maybe we're just, as you say, we're just scratching the surface of that. And so, Deirdre, obviously you've kind of been doing this a little bit, with some very unusual brands over the years. So what do you think was perhaps your most unusual brand that you managed to turn into a game?
Oh, well, I think Kenny G was a pretty surprising one when we took on Kenny G. And, that was one, I mean, we we wanted to make a game about jazz, and thought, well, who better to partner with than Mr. G? And so that was a fun adventure, because you want to talk about, unusual licenses. How do you even get a hold of some of these people to make a game for them? This one in particular, for Kenny G, we actually went to one of his concerts and hung out by the merch table until we could meet him. So it's all about the hustle. But then there's some other unusual ones, like back in before COVID, there used to be licensing show in Las Vegas. And we went to licensing show many years ago and met the team from Pan Am. And they were there to license for T-shirts and handbags and stuff. And we were like, have you guys ever thought about making a game? And they were like, we don't, like, what are you talking about? Like Monopoly? And it was like, well, not exactly. Like, we've got a whole idea about what we could do. And then actually when our independent studio became Funko Games, it was really exciting, because we went from being like pitching, like, somebody make this with us. This is a crazy idea, to sort of being the masters of our own domain, becoming publishers sort of overnight, and being like, oh, now we get to make our crazy Pan Am game. Let's go. Like, and everyone's like,
that's a great story. Yeah, I was wondering, like, some of the, and not just from your stuff, but the stuff like, how does that come about? And it is because I think a lot of these brand owners just aren't aware. They know the usual routes to market, but they just games is just like, what? And as you say, the kind of the default is, well, like a Monopoly. It's like, well,
Maybe it'll probably have a board, and then we'll go from there.
So many other games out there now, guys.
Yeah,
Monopoly's
yeah.
a great foundation, but keep exploring.
Yeah, but it's like, okay, like, yes, you can think about us, you can put us in that little box, and they can kind of wrap their head around it. And it's interesting too, working with brands that don't have a lot of experience in licensing, like to figure out that level with them. They don't know, like, do you want me to tell you if this game is fun? Do you send me a prototype? Do we do like, it's very different between working with, the big licensing houses, Warner Brothers, Universal, Disney. They're used to making all of these. They have whole teams dedicated to it. And then you work with another licensor where they are going to review handbags and t-shirts and your game, and they've never reviewed a game. So that's very interesting too, understanding how to set the level of the way you're interacting with them and supporting the licensor in this process, bringing them with you to get to a really great game at the end of it. And it's always fascinating. It's always a different and special path for that kind of opportunity.
That's a really good insight there, because you're right. And I'd like to talk to Omari and Eric about this, because obviously the selling is the hardest thing. And if you're selling a logo with, like, take the style guide, slap it on a t-shirt, hold up, yeah, that matches the style guide, tick, approved, you know. Whereas getting a game approved, you're right, it's kind of like, well, you've got to understand it, you've got to read it to start with, you might not even play it, you've got no reference point, I guess, is the hardest thing. It's like, what are they referencing in? A Monopoly? Or when was the last time they ever played a game? And you're right, it's easy when you're talking with the big guys. I'm thinking, Erica, have you got kind of any examples you could share that kind of talk about that a little bit, of sort of how you've gone about having to get something approved, maybe have you had to kind of do anything unusual or different?
I'll say licensors are very different from each other. I've been handed a style guide, and I've actually had to make one for someone before. So, it really depends on where they're at with things and if it's ever been translated before. Like, so if this is the first time something's ever been turned into a game for them, and, this is a brand new process, you're going through the whole thing with them. Right. And I have to say, sometimes that's fun. Like, some of the more, the really fun creators I've ever had to make or to meet tend to be on these projects where they've never translated that into a game before. So, you get these really funny situations where you are meeting the creator of, like, that comic or, whatever that is, because to them, they're like, oh, this is a game that my thing has turned into, and they're so excited by it. Right. But they don't know what level they want to be involved or how to be yet. So you get something very different there than, as Deirdre was saying, like, let's say, like a Disney, where they have literally that team of people, that's their entire job, right? And then even within that, it's broken out further out into, like, who deals with what is completely different than that independent, like, this is the first time my thing's been turned into something else, maybe then, other than, like, as I said, like t-shirts or a couple bits of merch, right? And so it might even be the first time for some independent things, it's actually the first merch ever might be the game now. And that's coming more and more, especially down the indie comic side and things like that, where it's like, you only had the comic book, nobody made anything else. Oh, by the way, now you actually get to play in that space. I made a game for it, right? So it is very different, the dealing directly with the creator to dealing with the big, the big company. It's not the same experience at all. I'll just put it that way.
I think from a designer's point of view of thinking, like, if we're trying to if people are watching this and they're kind of, they're thinking about, well, that's really daunting. Like, how do I even go about that? I think, Deirdre, your story about just meeting Pan Am it was really interesting, because you're right. There was a couple of products to say, which you sort of think, how do they actually come about? How do those kind of connected tissues to sort of meet in the universe? And it kind of shows you, maybe, if you've got good ideas for something, just kind of randomly turn up and just have a chat. I think taking them on that journey, I guess, of, like, trying to get into their heads of what they kind of want out of it, because obviously there is a business side to this. There's a kind of, like, well, I want to make some money.
Oh yeah, it's a business for sure. Yeah, it is very interesting. And to when you have an idea and you have a special license that you want to work with, it really is important to we get back to that feeling. How does the brand make you feel? But how does the brand feel to the stakeholders of that brand? Like kind of getting to Pan Am, like there what is celebrated there is the history and the legacy of that airline and all that that represented in its many years. And so for us, that's where we started because that's where they were, and that was the beautiful gem inside of this otherwise, which is was generally considered now an aesthetic brand. And
Yeah.
and so it's even hard to imagine, like, what are you going to do with Pan Am until you start going back. And maybe this is changing the subject, but we talk about so much, how do you start
Yeah.
working on an IP game? And for us, we go back to that foundational material. We bought every book we could find on the history of airline travel and this and that and the other, because there weren't a bunch of films. But when you're working on some big IP where you're like, okay, go out and watch the whole series of Seinfeld, watch every single episode, go watch the whole series of Curious George, go watch every episode, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Immerse yourself in it, go deep inside of that to really soak up, because some people come to the brand casually. Your fans are going to come to it sort of casually at a surface level, and some people are going to come in really deep, and they know that that farmer who lives next door to Curious George is named Farmer Rankin, and you better know his name when you're making this game. Even if you don't put it in there, you better know it.
Yeah.
It's very
No,
true, because it's beloved, right? You're translating something that people love, because if they didn't love it, there wouldn't be space to make the game in the first place.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and it just pays off so much to have things in your game for all levels of those types of consumers and gamers. It's beautiful to see the moment when that reference that's very obscure is posted about or something like that, and it's like, yeah, this is why it's good and fun to work with brands, because you tap into all of that love.
Yeah.
So Omari, I'm just thinking, because obviously you worked on your other games before and then you did the license game, did you kind of or did you know a lot about that obviously before you started it? I guess you did. You were obviously translating something you'd known, but there was obviously probably some differences as well you had to sort of research.
Yeah, the differences just in terms of like game design approach. I think we took a, I guess for us designing our own games where we have 100% creative control, we tend to focus so much on the gameplay, because that has to, in a lot of ways, be the thing to grab people and hold them, because they don't have a previously established, love for the world that we're creating. So we need the game design as really a hook, a strong hook to kind of bring people in. And then, but we want that to really work with whatever theme that we're putting with that game. And I think the design approach, especially as we're thinking about developing games specifically for brands now, we have to dig in and do the research. But when it comes to the gameplay, we kind of want to start out with a shell of what that game could look like, and approach licensors with ideas, approach them not with the intense sort of design process that we would normally do for our own games. And because we also want their input, we want their feedback, we want that to be a part of the process too. So I don't want to necessarily go to a brand with a complete game ready to go. I want something that's good, that feels interesting, like it might fit, and pitch that to them, and then really make it a collaborative thing. Because I think any brand that we work with in the short term as a publisher is going to be smaller, and we would love to be collaborators in that way, at least.
No, I think you're great, and I think this shows the nuance that doing a licensed game is different. It's different on a number of, on all different levels, really, on the way you design it, the way you pitch it, the way you have to research it. It's very different to most games. I know you might be doing a historical game that you were kind of researching, and obviously the gameplay, because you're right. When I started in the toy business, games business, and Deirdre, you probably remember this as well. It's like a lot of the licensed games were pretty poor. They were real kind of label slaps. They were like just take it off the shelf, slap it on, off you go. And I guess there was less competition out there. There was less choice. You could kind of get away with it. A lot of games companies could get away with it. There's obviously the classic. I don't know if you ever saw the computer game episode on Netflix where they talking about E.T. The guy kind of had to code it within like a weekend
2 weeks or something. Yeah. I would say that the turnaround time on some of those, like, as much as we can totally hate on the absolute garbage games that came out of the 90s, the turnaround time on some of them is insane when you start hearing some of the backstories, and then you're like, oh, that's how that happened.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, absolutely, because I think the classic example, and I think things are changing, but at least from my perspective, it was like most of the time was in the deal of getting the deal done. Then the deal would be done and go, hey, we've done it, guys. And then they walk down to the design team. Oh, by the way, can you design us a game? We like end of the week.
2 months and license expires. Let's go.
Because like the film's coming out and we've got to get it. It's like, what? And I think there is that, knowledge that that's how a lot of this stuff ended up. It was just the designers just didn't have time to do anything creative. It was like, well, just what have we got that we can slap a graphic on, But, fortunately, times are changing. And I think the brand owners see that and they want, they recognize they don't want a label slap and they want something unique. And I suppose that kind of being involved in that process. But I suppose at the end of the day, it's still a challenge, isn't it? These briefs do come along on the whole quite late, especially if they're movie related. The whole COVID thing has kind of completely screwed that process up because you've got products kind of sitting in warehouses which should be on shelves, which were tied to a movie and who knows what. But yeah, I think it's very interesting. I'm just thinking if we've got any kind of amusing stories from our time in developing games. I'm sure
I've got some stories that would turn your hair gray for sure. But over drinks, yeah. But it is, that's one of the great things about being an inventor, and I think all the folks on this panel are fairly prolific, right? If you have a lot in your closet, you've got a lot of games to pick from, engines you've developed and stuff like that, you're just always creating. We think about that a lot. It's like, okay, here comes this opportunity. And we do see it as an opportunity, especially when it's like the licensors aligned, the retailers aligned, publishers aligned. Here we go. You get another at bat, right? And you got to take your chance. And it's like, okay, what do we have in our closet? What IP, have we developed that's part of our, we've had, 500 plus games come to market, but we have thousands in our closet that we have developed because you got to pitch, right? And you're independent inventors, you're carrying your bags around and you're going to meeting all the publishers. And some of those are absolute diamonds waiting to find the right story, the right story to be connected to, the right publisher, the right opportunity. And so for us, we do, like, if something comes up and it's a fast opportunity, like 2 months or less to put something to get the files ready to go to production, it might be like, what do we have that we've already spent maybe months on that's just sitting there waiting? And that's been amazing. We've really been able to sort of leverage our own body of work, and that's a really nice leg up if you're sort of called to sprint on something. So we never throw anything away. I guess it's kind of a problem, but it's also good.
It's a good problem. But I think you bring on a good kind of topic to continue on to, is that a lot of IP games, because they are meant to have this wider audience, oftentimes what they fall into is what you almost want to be like an introduction to the mechanic. So, unfortunately, there's not a ton of IPs, I would say, that will allow you to be able to layer a lot of mechanics in, kind of get heavy, just because the audience might not be there now. Don't get me wrong. I have all this faith in the future that there's going to be all kinds of wacky stuff coming, just because there are lots of gamers who are interested. But for the most part, these tend to be entry level games, which means I have to assume you've never played anything like this in your life. So if I'm giving this to you, it's either, you know, two pseudo mechanics put together, it's one mechanic, and I'm introducing you for the first time. And so in a lot of ways, you have the really fun part of I'm introducing someone to a brand new type of gaming, right? So it's not just the Monopoly, but it's also knowing that you have to be really, really careful, because it has to be that, you know, clean but simple, right? And that in itself is actually a really hard thing to do well, right? And so I think that's where IP games take another kind of interesting turn, in that you are genuinely introducing people to the first time they've ever probably seen this type of mechanic. They have to get it. They have to feel like they can get it, right? That it's not intimidating, so that they can keep going. And that's all we ever want as game designers. Like, okay, you got that one. Okay, then you're going to learn this one, and then you're going to learn this one, and then we can put them together, and then you can do this, right? But we're not there yet. And so the cool thing is for this first step, at least.
No, I think
Erica, sorry, go ahead, Rich.
Go.
I was going to say, Erica, you're so right on about that. We talk about that a lot, like especially if you're developing for the mass aisle and for a big brand that people know, like this may be the first game they've played since they played Uno 30 years ago or whatever, right? You got to sneak up on them, right? You got to bring them along with you. If you're going to put out a deck builder, this might be the first deck builder they have ever played. And what makes it viable for them is meeting them where they are and building it up. Kind of like we had that great experience with Hogwarts Battle, right? Like that really brought a lot of people into the hobby, because they love Harry Potter, and this is their first deck builder. So meet them where they are and then build them up. But the IP also serves as a hook. They can understand the game mechanics more clearly, because they understand, oh, I'm fighting Voldemort, so I have to play my cards like this. I'm telling this story, so I have to do that. And when you can connect that, you can bring new people into gaming as a hobby, I think. And
you're right.
Yeah.
You've got the story, as you said, we start with talking about the story at the start, that the sandbox, in that if you're just coming to a game you don't know, no rules, no history, nothing, you've got to just read rules, and it's all new to you. Whereas you're right, Deirdre, if you can make a gameplay mechanic work with a sort of something that they kind of know from the property, obviously that's the ideal scenario, it's sort of like a logical glue that goes on in there.
I was gonna say, I actually call it my game logic. So when you have an existing world, they already understand as fans how that world works, which is actually to your advantage, because that's how you translate most of your rules. That's where your theme, integrates perfectly into your mechanics, because they're like, well, that's what it's supposed to do. You're like, exactly, that is what it's supposed to do.
Yeah. Like what? If you're, it's great.
No, go.
Less rules.
I'm here to you guys, not to me. Yeah.
Omari, it sounded like you were going to say something. I'm sorry.
Oh, I mean, I'm totally in agreement. Like that, as a sort of theme first designer, like you have to pay so much attention to how the expectations of how the world works matches your gameplay. And yeah, not doing that is always going to be such a disconnect for the player and stop them from getting in. And yeah, the simpler, the fewer rules, the better is always kind of the approach. So I mean, I'm now working on my third licensed game, and it just is very interesting trying to navigate that space and make clean rules that also fit the world that you're working with.
Yeah, clean and simple is not easy.
I think we're starting like talking about like the Twitter thing. That is the problem, isn't it? Because you're going to have the super fans who want everything and every morsel in there, and kind of, but for the vast majority of the time, you're trying to attract Joe Public. You're trying to attract somebody who maybe not played a game for a long time, or just, they love the license, but, they're just not gamers. But they kind of like the idea of being immersed in the world. And I think it's just sort of finding that balance. And I I don't know, from my history, I sort of have seen games where, you know, the other thing is that you buy, you know, there might be someone in the family or friend who's really into license, but none of their friends are into that license either. And so when you try and find, oh, can I find 3 other people to play with? You know, they know nothing about this license. And then that's a problem, because there's one person, does the person who knows all that license, do they have some kind of inbuilt strategic win condition, you know, that they know all this stuff? I think that's another thing to factor in, you know, when you've got games which, you know, just, they have niche appeal. It's fine if you can get, you know, another 3 people that are, you know, into the same license as you. So yeah, I've seen some of those kind of, I think there's sort of successes and failures, but I think we've really touched on a lot of things that could make it a success, you know, as designers. I think don't go in rigidly with, this is my game mechanic and it will fit this license, and well, tough if it doesn't, you know, that's not going to work.
That might work for if you're making up the theme yourself, but yeah, it's funny because people do often talk about theme or mechanic first. I think you're always, though, going to be theme first with IP, because you can't not be.
No, you're right. You're right. I think, and it's trying to, and Omari, like Omari said, you know, it's still got to be a great game, and we kind of forget that, you know, ultimately they're buying a game as well as a license, you know, and you don't want to kind of sour the license by having a kind of poor game. And I think also, I don't know what you guys feel about this, but I kind of feel that there's a slightly more burden on the game designer with a licensed game, in the respect of, I often find that a lot of licensed and brand owners, they're obviously very interested in dissecting certain elements of the game which relate to the brand, like the key story points, but they're not really there to critique the game. They kind of trust you that it plays. You know, a lot of them don't even want to play the game necessarily. They kind of like want to see it, and they want to touch it, and they want to kind of, but they're not really, because they might not necessarily be gamers themselves, and they're just trying to get the business done, you know. So I think the onus comes a little bit more to the game designers, kind of be the person who's actually going to make sure the game works, you know, more so than even in a normal sense, where you've got other, if it's not a license, you've got more people kind of invested in kind of helping you making that. But in a role of a license game, there's a lot of people kind of who are adjacencies who are actually now more interested in just getting the licensing done, you know, rather than the product's just there for the ride, you know, to kind of bring in the dollars.
Yeah. In a situation like that, like I've been on one of the projects where it's a very short time span, and it changed, I think, the way that I sort of designed games, understanding that this is a license that is sort of well known, but like a little bit niche, but at the same time, knowing that that's potentially your player base, you also don't necessarily have to shoot for with the design. You don't need it to be like the award-winning game. Like, you have to find a balance of like, okay, I need this game to accurately like depict what is happening with this brand and in this world, and I need it to elevate above like this, just slap it a name on there, and I need it to be a good game, but how much time can I effectively spend getting it to the point where it's gonna sell, and it's gonna sell well, and it's gonna sell to the point that the brand expects, and finding the right balance of getting the simplicity there, and the level of fun that you need on a time schedule. It all can feel a little bit overwhelming trying to manage all that and manage it all in a short time period. But I don't know. I've had good end results, things that I'm happy with, just kind of working in the space so far. So I think it's good, and I wouldn't shy away from it just because it's dealing with licenses. It's a little tricky.
No, I think you've hit on some great points. I think it is about balance. It's always a trade-off between something and something. You know, it's very rare you get that perfect synergy, a perfect game mechanic. And the licensor loves everything. There's always something. The cost is bang on. You know, it's like there's always, and particularly then with the extra time pressure, I think it tends to be more with licensed games. They always seem to be under slightly more time pressure, because it's not just something you could kind of. Most companies obviously have got something in a slate, but you know, if it's a non-licensed property and an owned product, if it really isn't working, some companies do, okay, look, we're going to push it out a year and make sure it's 100%. that doesn't happen often with a license thing because the deals are in place. It's got to happen.
If the license expires, and it depends on what you've got, arranged too, right? Like there's long-term relationships, but yes, I think people do need to recognize that, like, not only do IP games have to be out by a certain time, but if an IP expires, it actually means that that game will likely disappear from a shelf unless it gets renewed. And so that brings about a whole other interesting idea of these games that are going to rotate on a level that others don't, right? And things like that. And it's an interesting space. It's one of the only spaces too where there's such thing as too much game. You can actually really overwhelm people. So it's I think kids are probably the only other space I can say the same thing for, where it really matters who this is for. And it'll adjust everything you're doing because of it.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And we're sort of, I think, by the time just look at the clock, it's like, I think we're nearly at time. So I think we've sort of, that's a great point to kind of sort of start talking at the end on. But I also kind of wanted just to ask you if there's any kind of brands that you kind of love to work on, if there's any kind of areas, even if not specific brands, but areas you think, oh, I'd love to kind of develop a game for that kind of brand. I don't know, Deirdre, if you've probably got a list of them that you could
I chase them down myself.
Goodness, yeah. I told you we stalk people at jazz clubs. It's really for us. I mean, we're very lucky to be at Funko. And they have the most incredible world-class licensing team. I mean, because of the collectibles business, that's this amazing entity. And so we really, a lot of folks come to us, which we are grateful for. Folks come to us and asking to make games for them. And it's really about, deciding what ignites joy in us. What do we want to put out into the world? What do we want to share? And what stories do we want to tell? Because, we all have this one wild and precious life, right? What are you doing with your time? What are you putting out into the world? So if it is, Bob Ross that sets you on fire, if it's Mickey Mouse, whatever it is, like, tell the stories that you love. And we should all be so lucky to get to do this. It's incredible. So for independent inventors out there, if there are brands you want to work on and you know which publishers have those brands, you can pitch them and say, this would be great for, next time you're making a game for Cars or Frozen, or I'm just looking at stuff back there on your shelf, Rich, but you can go right to them and say, I know you guys have this brand and I have the next thing for you in that story, in that line. That's amazing. You can do that and, develop things that are for it and go to those publishers who have those big licensing agreements. Because a lot of folks will say, like, I have a game I want to make for Disney. How do I get Disney to put it out? Well, Disney's not going to put it out. Someone who has the Disney license is going to put it out, right? Because there's a business relationship there. So kind of understanding how that works. But look for things, and we look for things that make us happy, that make us feel good, and our stories we want to tell. There are things that have been on my list. I've been in the business 15 years. There are things on my list that have been on my list this whole time that, we're just now unlocking. I mean, it's like, you got to put them on your list and put it out there into the world. Yeah.
So Omari, have you got any, do you think it's there more song lyric games out there that could get out?
I mean, realistically, music is one of the places that I definitely am gonna seek out more opportunities. I thought about posting the other day, watching Lil Nas X navigate the music space and create worlds with both music and video. That was something I almost tweeted out the other day, thinking this is the type of gaming experience that I think could be super special. And I'm also super into fashion. So I think I've been ideating about fashion games that could potentially use fashion licenses or cosmetics even. Because doing a song really just opened my eyes to everything that was potentially possible. So I'm kind of thinking in those directions now.
That's great. I think you're right. You know, the world is our oyster, really, in terms of how, you know, if the market share is there, they've got the social awareness, they can kind of, whereas we're not relying on someone walking into a toy shop and the limited space that games have and seeing your licensed game there. You know, that because those limitations have gone, those walls are sort of long gone. There's so much potential for these things to get in front of those kind of consumers. And Erica, is there anything you could talk about? Anything that's kind of even on a personal passion that you'd love to kind of develop a game for?
Oh, I mean, I absolutely love when I'm already like a big fan of something. I'm like, I'm going to get to play with this now. But that's the idea, is that if you're going to do licenses, you have to become a fan of everything, even if you didn't know you were. So, you know, there's new stuff that I'm working on right now. I think I'm allowed to say, like, you know, I'm working on something for, you know, Gabby's Dollhouse. It's like, I'm now watching that with my 6-year-old, and, you know, whether he's here or not, I'm still watching it because I am now going to be a giant Gabby's Dollhouse fan, right? You know, it's jumping into those worlds, and you are now going to be one of its #1 fans, because you have to say, well, what experience would this fan want? Because a game is all about the fun. Where's the fun, right? And that's the whole reason we play test, because the minute something dropped, it's like, whoop, that's not fun. Fix it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's really what it comes down to. It's all about the feeling all the way through. And again, you don't have the luxury sometimes of those, you know, more knowledgeable gamers who are thinking through things differently. Everybody who's playing at this level is feeling the game as they're going. And it's a very different experience. So it's making sure that you are 100% a fan of that thing, because you want, with that feeling that you want as a fan, they want as a fan, and you got to translate that.
That's fantastic. I think that's a great thing to end on, really, to start get people to think about the feeling, because I think it's often, you know, we've talked about it, it's come up a lot, it kind of gets forgotten sometimes, but it is the core driver. And I think when you can kind of take the license and use it as an amplifier for those feelings, that you can kind of, like, you know, it was all right before, but now we brought this license in and we've sort of stuck them together. It's like, whoa, yeah, now I get it. Now the feeling's coming, you know. So look, guys, really, really great to chat to you today. I think we're pretty much up to time. So I could, otherwise Billy tells me off, otherwise they're gone for an hour or something. It wrecks his schedule. But thanks. I really look forward to seeing what products you're going to come out with in the coming years. So much stuff. It's always a joy these days to see, you know, particularly with the sort of IP-driven products. There's always something so interesting. As you say, brand owners are so much more open now to exploiting this. So if there's any brand owners watching this, contact a game designer.
Oh, and if you're a game designer, just know that there are lots of companies that take submissions that have brands, right? Not all of them do, but a lot of them do.
Yeah, and do your research. That's always the thing. Don't go to a brand owner who doesn't have the license. I'm always trying to do that. Or at least maybe join the dots. I think that's a possible thing today. You know, sort of go and speak to, especially a smaller company. You know, smaller companies, smaller brand owners. If you're the designer, you can kind of maybe be the glue that kind of makes that deal happen. So, anyway. Again, thanks everyone. That's the end for the Play Creators IP chat. There's obviously a lot more stuff to find on the Play Creators Festival, other interviews across a bunch of different topics. So for now, see ya, bye.